I stood outside my own house, my bags at my feet, as my stepmother smirked from the doorway. "It's all mine now," she said, crossing her arms like she had just won some grand prize. My father had only been gone for a few weeks, and she had already thrown me out without a second thought. I had nowhere to go, no idea what to do next, but just when I thought she had taken everything from me, a letter arrived that changed everything. She thought she had won, but she had no idea what was coming. I never thought my life would unravel so quickly, never imagined that everything I had built, everything I had known, could be ripped away in an instant. My name is Daniel, and until a few weeks ago, I thought I had some level of security, some kind of foundation that would always be there, no matter what happened. My father had always been my rock, the one person I could depend on, the man who had raised me after my mother passed away when I was just a kid. He had been strong, dependable, and fair, a man who believed in hard work, honesty, and always doing the right thing. I admired him more than words could express, and in many ways, I shaped my entire life around the values he instilled in me. But everything changed when he met her. Olivia came into our lives a few years ago, a polished woman with perfect hair, expensive taste, and an artificial sweetness that never quite felt real. At first, she was friendly, overly friendly, in fact, showering my father with affection and pretending to be interested in every little detail of my life. But there was something about her that always felt off, something beneath the surface that didn't quite match the perfect image she worked so hard to maintain. She was the type who smiled too much when others were watching, always making sure to seem warm and caring in public, but when we were alone, when no one else was around, her mask would slip just enough for me to see who she really was. There was an edge to her, a quiet arrogance, a way she carried herself that made it clear she thought she was better than everyone else, including me. I tried to ignore it. My father was happy, and that was what mattered. He deserved someone who made him feel loved, who took care of him after everything he had been through. So I swallowed my doubts, told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I just didn't like the idea of someone new stepping into our lives and changing everything. But deep down, I never fully trusted Olivia, and as it turned out, I was right not to. When my father passed away suddenly, my world shattered. One moment, he was there, laughing, making plans for the future, talking about how we would renovate the kitchen together, and the next he was just gone. The loss was suffocating, the grief overwhelming, but even as I struggled to process it, I clung to the one thing I had left, our home. The house my father had bought, the place we had made memories in, the one thing that still felt like a connection to him. But Olivia had other plans. At first, she acted the part of the grieving widow, dabbing at her dry eyes, putting on a somber face for the neighbors and friends who came to pay their respects. She wrapped herself in black, spoke in hushed tones, played the role of the heartbroken wife flawlessly. But as soon as the funeral was over, as soon as the guests had left and the condolences stopped rolling in, she wasted no time showing me who she truly was. I came home one evening, exhausted from handling the legal paperwork surrounding my father's estate, only to find Olivia standing in the doorway, arms crossed, a look of pure satisfaction on her face. The moment I saw her expression, I knew something was wrong. "You need to pack your things," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy, the kind of fake kindness that barely masked the amusement underneath. "This house belongs to me now." For a moment, I just stood there, unable to process what she had just said. My father would never have left me with nothing. He had always been careful with his finances, always made sure I was taken care of. But before I could say anything, she shoved a folder into my hands, filled with legal documents, thick pages of official-looking paperwork that blurred in my vision as I tried to make sense of them. "Your father left everything to me," Olivia continued, her tone casual, like she was discussing the weather rather than stealing my entire future. "The house, the savings, everything. So unless you want to start paying rent, you need to leave." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. This had to be a mistake. My father wouldn't have done this. He wouldn't have left me homeless, penniless, abandoned. But as I looked at Olivia, at the smug triumph in her eyes, realization dawned on me. This wasn't an accident. This was planned. Had she manipulated him? Pressured him into signing something when he was too weak to fight back? Had she taken advantage of his grief over losing my mother, twisting his emotions until he made a decision he never would have otherwise? My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at her, searching for any sign that she was lying, that this was some cruel joke, that there was still some logical explanation for how this could be happening. But there was no hesitation in her expression, No remorse, no second-guessing. Olivia had been waiting for this moment. I felt my fingers tighten around the papers, my mind racing, trying to find a way to argue, to fight back, to stop this. This isn't right, I said finally, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be, my throat tight. He wouldn't have done this to me. There's no way. She let out a small, almost pitying laugh. Oh, Daniel, she sighed, shaking her head like I was some naive child who didn't understand how the world worked. Life isn't fair. Now, I'd start packing if I were you. I'd hate to have to call the police. The threat was clear. She was done playing nice. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my entire life crumbling around me, the home I had known since childhood suddenly nothing more than a memory. I had no choice. With nowhere else to go, I packed my things in silence, walking out of the house I had grown up in, the house my father had built for us, not her. But Olivia had made one crucial mistake. She underestimated me. And I was about to show her just how wrong she was. The first few nights after Olivia threw me out of my own home were some of the longest and most frustrating of my life, filled with restless thoughts, unanswered questions, and a rage that simmered just beneath the surface. I crashed on my best friend Alex's couch, grateful for the temporary shelter, but unable to find even a moment of peace. No matter how many times I tried to make sense of what had happened, I kept coming back to the same unsettling conclusion. Something wasn't right. My father had always been incredibly responsible when it came to his finances, making sure that every bill was paid, every investment was carefully considered, and every asset was accounted for with meticulous detail. He had always been the kind of man who planned ahead, the kind of father who would never leave me with nothing, no matter what happened. But somehow, Olivia had taken everything, our home, the savings, every trace of security my father had built for me. And the way she had done it, so cold and calculated, made it clear that this wasn't just a stroke of bad luck or an unfortunate oversight. No, this had been planned. I had no way of proving it yet, but deep down, I knew Olivia had manipulated something, twisted something, forged something to make sure that she walked away with everything while I was left standing on the street. I couldn't shake the thought that my father had never intended for this to happen, that the real truth had been buried somewhere beneath Olivia's lies. And there was only one person who could help me find it. Mr. Callahan had been my father's lawyer for as long as I could remember, a man with a firm handshake, a no-nonsense attitude, and an air of quiet wisdom that made you feel like he knew every answer before you even asked the question. If there was anyone who could tell me what was really going on, it was him. So I picked up the phone, dialed his office number, and prayed that he would have the answers I was looking for. The moment I told him what had happened, the silence on the other end of the line sent a cold chill through me. He didn't immediately react with shock or outrage, didn't offer any words of comfort or reassurance. Instead, he was just quiet. Too quiet. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a slow, measured sigh, the kind that told me he already suspected something wasn't right but hadn't been able to do anything about it. "Daniel," he said carefully, his voice low and serious, "there's something you need to see." His words sent my mind spinning in a dozen different directions, filling me with both dread and anticipation. What could he have found? If my father had really left everything to Olivia, then there wouldn't be anything left to see, nothing that would change the outcome, nothing that would help me get my home back. But something in Mr. Callahan's tone told me otherwise, told me that there was more to this story than Olivia wanted me to believe. "I need you to come by my office first thing tomorrow morning," he continued. "There's something I was supposed to give you after your father's passing, but it seems Olivia made sure it never reached you." I barely slept that night, my mind racing with possibilities, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and anger. Olivia had stolen everything from me, but had she really been able to cover all her tracks? If there was even a chance that my father had left something behind for me, even the smallest shred of proof that Olivia had manipulated his will, I had to find it. The next morning, I arrived at Mr. Callahan's office before the sun had fully risen, my body running on little more than adrenaline and sheer determination. He was already waiting for me when I stepped inside, his face grim, his usual composed demeanor carrying an edge of something else, something that looked an awful lot like frustration. Without a word, he reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a thick envelope, and slid it across the polished wood surface toward me. "This," he said, tapping the envelope with his finger, "is your father's real will." The breath caught in my throat, my fingers trembling slightly as I reached for the envelope, my heart hammering against my ribcage. I could already feel it, the weight of the truth sitting right in front of me, The confirmation that Olivia had lied, that she had stolen everything under false pretenses. I ripped open the envelope, my eyes scanning the neatly typed pages, my father's familiar signature standing out like a beacon against the official legal text. And then I saw it, the words that changed everything. My father had never left everything to Olivia. In fact, he had left the house and the majority of his assets to me. The only thing Olivia was supposed to receive was a small sum of money, just enough to help her transition into life without my father, and a single car from his collection. That was it. She was never meant to inherit the entire estate, never meant to take control of everything he had worked so hard to build, never meant to have the power to throw me out of my own home. I looked up at Mr. Callahan, my vision blurring slightly as the sheer weight of the revelation sank in. She lied, I whispered, my voice barely audible, my hands tightening around the will as if I needed to hold on to it to keep myself grounded. She took everything. Mr. Callahan nodded grimly. And now, he said, his voice steady and firm, we're going to take it all back. My pulse pounded in my ears as the truth settled over me like a storm cloud, dark and full of fury. Olivia had spent the last few weeks believing she had won, believing she had gotten away with her deception, believing that I was too weak, too lost, too helpless to fight back. But she had underestimated me. And now, she was about to learn just how wrong she had been. The weight of my father's real will felt heavy in my hands, the words on the page a stark contrast to the lies Olivia had spun so effortlessly. My home, my father's savings, everything that should have been mine had been stolen right out from under me, taken by a woman who had never truly belonged in our family in the first place. The anger that burned in my chest was unlike anything I had ever felt before, a fire that only grew the longer I thought about how smug she had been, how she had looked me in the eye and dared to tell me it was all hers. She had lied, forged documents, manipulated the legal system, and convinced everyone that she was the rightful heir to my father's estate. But now, I had the truth in front of me, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Mr. Callahan, his sharp eyes fixed on me from across the desk, leaned forward slightly and laced his fingers together, his expression unreadable but serious. Daniel, I won't sugarcoat this, he said in a steady, measured tone. What Olivia did is outright fraud, and legally, she has no claim to your father's estate. But that doesn't mean this is going to be easy. She's already been living off your father's money, and people like her? They don't let go of power without a fight. His words sent a shiver down my spine, not because I was afraid, but because I knew deep down that he was right. Olivia had played dirty from the very beginning, and there was no reason to believe she would suddenly start playing fair just because the truth had come to light. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm despite the storm raging inside me. I don't care how hard it is, I said firmly, my voice steadier than I expected. I don't care how long it takes or what she tries to pull next. That house was my father's. That money was meant for me. I'm not going to let her get away with this. The words felt final, like a declaration of war, and as soon as I said them, something shifted in Mr. Callahan's expression. He gave me a small, approving nod before pulling out a thick folder filled with legal documents, flipping through them with the ease of someone who had been in this business for far too long. We're going to file an official challenge to the fraudulent will, he explained, sliding a few pages toward me and pointing to the signature lines at the bottom. This is the first step. We'll present your father's real will to the court, along with evidence that Olivia fabricated her version. But she's not going to roll over and accept defeat. She's going to fight back, and you need to be ready for that. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. I had never been in a legal battle before, had never even stepped foot inside a courtroom for anything more than a parking ticket. But this wasn't just about legal proceedings, this was about justice. What's the worst she can do? I asked, my hands tightening around the pen as I prepared to sign the first set of documents. Mr. Callahan exhaled slowly, adjusting his glasses before answering. She can drag this out for months, maybe even years, filing appeals, making counterclaims, doing anything she can to stall the process while she continues to live in your home and drain your father's accounts. She can try to manipulate public sympathy, paint herself as the grieving widow, make it seem like you are the one trying to take what isn't yours. And if she's really desperate, she might even try to destroy evidence before we can use it in court. The thought made my stomach turn, the idea that Olivia, who had already done so much damage, could continue to twist the truth, continue to make me look like the villain, continue to live in the house my father had built while pretending I didn't exist. But I had spent enough time letting her get away with things, enough time standing in the shadows, enough time watching as she took what was never hers to begin with. That ended now. Then we need to move fast, I said, pressing the pen to the paper and signing my name with a determination I hadn't felt in weeks. Before she has a chance to cover her tracks. Mr. Callahan nodded in agreement, his hands already moving efficiently as he gathered the signed documents and added them to the case file. I'll file the paperwork today, he confirmed. But Daniel, be prepared. Olivia is going to fight hard to hold on to that house. She's already spent weeks convincing everyone that she's the sole heir. She won't just step aside without a fight. I met his gaze, feeling the weight of everything that was about to come crashing down, but refusing to back down from what I knew was right. Then let's make sure she loses, I said simply, my voice unwavering. By the time I left Mr. Callahan's office, the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface had transformed into something sharper, something more focused. Olivia thought she had already won, thought she had erased me from my own father's legacy, thought she had secured her future without any consequences. But she had made a fatal mistake. She had underestimated me. She had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation, years weaving lies so carefully that people rarely questioned them. But this time, she wasn't dealing with someone who would just roll over and accept defeat. This time, she had taken something from the wrong person, and she was about to find out just how wrong she had been. The letter had been sent out with urgency, stamped with the weight of legal action, carrying the undeniable truth that Olivia had spent weeks trying to bury beneath layers of deception. It was the kind of document that could not be ignored, a formal demand that cut through the carefully crafted lies she had built around herself. I had imagined the moment she opened it, pictured the smug expression on her face melting away as she read the words that confirmed her worst fear, that I knew the truth, that she wasn't as untouchable as she believed, that she was no longer in control. I didn't have to wait long for her reaction. It came in the form of a phone call from an unknown number, the kind of desperate move someone makes when they realize their carefully constructed world is beginning to crumble. The second I picked up, I was greeted by her voice, no longer masked in artificial politeness, no longer dripping with that sickly sweet charm she had used so easily in the past. Instead, it was sharp, raw, and laced with pure rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her voice so loud that I had to pull the phone away from my ear for a brief moment. Gone was the composed, elegant woman who had stood in my doorway with feigned sympathy. This was the real Olivia, the one who thrived on control, who manipulated without remorse, who had never imagined that I would actually fight back. "You don't stand a chance against me, Daniel," she spat, her words laced with venom. "The house is mine, the money is mine, and you need to accept that before you embarrass yourself any further." I leaned back against the kitchen counter of my friend Alex's apartment, my fingers tightening around the phone, but my expression calm, almost amused. For the first time since this nightmare had started, I could hear something in Olivia's voice that hadn't been there before: fear. She wasn't calling to gloat, wasn't calling to taunt me about how I had lost, wasn't reveling in my misfortune the way she had when she threw me out of my own home. No, this time, she was calling because she knew she had been caught, because she knew she was losing control of the situation, because she knew that I wasn't backing down. "Actually, Olivia," I said, keeping my voice steady, almost casual, letting each word sink in with slow precision. "The real will says otherwise. And soon everyone else will know it too." The silence that followed was brief but heavy, thick with unspoken panic, the kind that comes when someone is desperately trying to regain their footing after being blindsided by something they never saw coming. I could almost hear her mind racing, scrambling for an argument, a counterattack, some way to claw back the power she had wielded so easily before. But this time, she didn't have control of the narrative. I did. "That will is fake," she snapped finally, her voice regaining some of its earlier sharpness, though I could hear the unsteadiness beneath it. "No judge is going to believe you over me, Daniel. You don't have the resources, you don't have the experience, and you sure as hell don't have the kind of influence I do. You're wasting your time." I let out a slow breath, letting her words roll over me without effect, because for the first time, I could hear it for what it really was: desperation. She was trying to convince herself, as much as she was trying to convince me. Olivia had spent so long believing she had already won, spent so much time telling herself that I was powerless, that when faced with the reality of my fight, she didn't know how to react. "You can keep telling yourself that if it helps you sleep at night," I said, my tone unfazed, my confidence unwavering, "but the truth is, You forged a legal document, Olivia. That's not just fraud. That's a crime. And no matter how much influence you think you have, it's not going to be enough to save you from the consequences of what you did. I could practically feel the way her breath hitched, the way my words struck a nerve, the way the foundation of lies she had built for herself was now shaking beneath her feet. But instead of backing down, instead of showing even an ounce of regret, she did what people like her always did. She doubled down. You think you're so clever, she sneered, her voice turning cold, calculated, the panic now buried beneath layers of practiced manipulation. But you don't understand the kind of game you're playing, Daniel. You're not dealing with someone who plays by the rules. You're dealing with someone who wins. And if you think I'm just going to sit back and let you take everything from me, you're even more naive than I thought. There it was, the real Olivia, the woman who had spent years perfecting the art of deception, the woman who had convinced my father to sign over everything without anyone questioning it, the woman who believed she was untouchable because she had never faced someone willing to challenge her before. But she had underestimated me, and that was going to be her downfall. I guess we'll see, I said simply, my grip loosening on the phone as I prepared to end the call. You might want to start looking for a new place to live, Olivia. Because by the time I'm done, you won't have anything left. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. Instead, I ended the call, cutting her off mid-breath, leaving her alone with the reality she was trying so hard to deny. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that I would never challenge her, so convinced that she had locked me out of my own father's legacy for good. But she had made a fatal mistake. She thought she had already won before the fight had even begun. And now, she was about to learn just how wrong she had been. I had expected Olivia to fight back, had known that she wouldn't just accept defeat without doing everything in her power to make my life miserable, but even I hadn't anticipated just how quickly she would escalate things. Less than 24 hours after our phone call, I received a notice taped to the door of my friend Alex's apartment, an official-looking document stamped with legal jargon that made my stomach twist the moment I read the words printed in bold at the top. Eviction notice, unlawful trespassing. I stared at the paper for a long moment, my hands tightening at my sides, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of what Olivia was trying to pull. She wasn't just content with stealing my home. She was actively trying to erase me from it entirely, to ensure that I couldn't even step foot on the property before the case made it to court. It was a power move, a calculated attempt to break me down, to make me feel like I was already losing before I even had the chance to fight back. But all it did was strengthen my resolve, solidifying the fact that Olivia wasn't just a liar, she was a dangerous one. That night, as I sat at the small kitchen table in Alex's apartment, my mind still spinning from everything that had happened, my phone rang, and when I saw Mr. Callahan's name on the screen, a part of me braced for more bad news. But the moment I heard his voice, I knew this wasn't just another legal update. There was something in his tone, something tense and urgent, something that sent a shiver of anticipation down my spine. "Daniel," he said, his voice tight, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of something else, something I couldn't quite place. "I had my team dig into Olivia's past, and you won't believe what we found." My stomach clenched at his words, my grip on the phone tightening instinctively. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding faster now, my mind already running through the possibilities, already expecting the worst, but hoping for something I could use against her. There was a slight pause, the kind that made it clear Mr. Callahan was carefully choosing his words, making sure that what he was about to tell me was presented in the most direct way possible. And then, finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "She's done this before," he revealed, the weight of those words hitting me like a punch to the gut. "Two other men, both widowers. Both of them left their homes and assets to her in their wills, except, in both cases, their children challenged it in court. And both times, Olivia settled out of court before things could go too far." My breath caught in my throat, my entire body going still as the reality of what he was saying sank in. Olivia hadn't just stolen from me, she had a pattern, a history of manipulating vulnerable men, embedding herself into their lives, and then ensuring that when they passed away, she walked away with everything. This wasn't just some one-time scheme she had pulled on my father, this was a profession for her. "She's a predator," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper, my hands gripping the edges of the table as my mind reeled. "She's been doing this for years, hasn't she?" Callahan let out a heavy sigh, and though I couldn't see him, I could practically feel his nod through the phone. "That's what it looks like," he confirmed. "She finds wealthy men, gains their trust, ensures she has control over their affairs, And then when they die, she takes everything. The pattern is too clear to ignore. A sick feeling twisted in my gut, anger mixing with disgust as I thought about the fact that Olivia had likely planned this from the moment she met my father, that every kind word, every affectionate gesture, every seemingly innocent act had been nothing more than calculated manipulation. And worse than that, she had gotten away with it before. How did she settle? I asked, my voice tight, my mind racing through the implications. Why didn't the other families expose hers? Callahan hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. Money, he admitted finally. Both families settled because Olivia offered them enough to make it not worth going through a long legal battle. She had already drained so much from their father's estates that she could afford to buy their silence. And considering how expensive court cases like this can be, I'm guessing they figured it was easier to take what they could and move on. My jaw clenched so tightly that I could feel the tension radiating through my skull, my entire body stiff, with barely contained rage. She had paid them off. She had stolen from them, manipulated their fathers, destroyed families, and when the truth had started creeping too close, she had simply bought her way out of consequences. But that wasn't going to happen this time, because I wasn't going to settle. I wasn't going to let her win again. She's not paying her way out of this one, I said, my voice firm, leaving no room for doubt, no room for hesitation. I don't care how long this takes. I don't care how hard she fights. I'm taking this all the way. Callahan let out a small chuckle, one that carried more approval than amusement. I was hoping you'd say that, he admitted. Because Olivia's pattern of behavior might just be what we need to bury her in court. A slow, cold smile pulled at the edges of my lips, a sharp contrast to the storm of anger brewing inside me. Olivia had spent years perfecting her con, slipping through the cracks, ensuring that her victims were too broken, too tired, or too financially drained to fight back. But she had underestimated me, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't going to be able to run. By now, I understood Olivia well enough to know that she would do anything to avoid a public trial, especially one that exposed the truth about her long history of deception. She thrived on control, relied on manipulating people into seeing her as the grieving widow, the victim, the fragile woman left behind by a loving husband. If the truth came out, that she had stolen from multiple families, forged wills, and manipulated vulnerable men for years, her entire act would collapse, and she'd lose everything she had built for herself. That was exactly what Callahan and I planned to use against her. The key to taking Olivia down wasn't just proving in court that she had forged my father's will. It was ensuring that by the time she got to court, she had already lost in the eyes of the public. If we handled this right, she wouldn't just be fighting me in a legal battle, she'd be fighting a much bigger enemy. So we set a trap, one that she wouldn't see coming until it was far too late to escape. Callahan reached out to his contacts in the local press, quietly leaking the information we had uncovered about Olivia's past, ensuring that the right people got access to the real story. Reporters, especially the kind who specialized in exposing corruption and high-profile scandals, were eager to sink their teeth into something like this. It didn't take long before the first article hit the internet, its headline impossible to ignore. Wealthy widow accused of estate fraud, again. From that moment, everything moved like a tidal wave, impossible to stop once it gained momentum. More articles followed, detailing the pattern Callahan's team had uncovered, linking Olivia's name to the two previous cases she had quietly settled out of court, questioning whether there were even more victims who had never come forward. Reporters started digging into her past, finding inconsistencies in her financial history, piecing together a timeline that painted her as something far more sinister than a grieving widow. She was no longer just the woman who had inherited my father's fortune. She was now a suspect, someone whose wealth and power were built on the foundations of fraud. And I knew Olivia would see it. She had spent her entire life controlling the narrative, ensuring that people only saw what she wanted them to see, manipulating situations so that she always came out on top. But for the first time, she was not in control, and I knew it would drive her insane. So I waited, knowing it was only a matter of time before she snapped. It didn't take long. My phone rang late that night, the number hidden, the call unexpected but not surprising. I answered without hesitation, already knowing exactly who it was. "You're ruining my life," Olivia hissed the moment I picked up, her voice sharp, frantic, and laced with pure rage. There was no more fake charm, no more calculated sweetness, no more rehearsed grief. This was the real Olivia, the one who had spent her life conning people, the one who had never imagined that someone would fight back and win. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she spat, and for the first time, I could hear the panic creeping into her voice. I let a slow breath pass through my lips, keeping my tone calm, controlled, knowing that the more composed I was, the more unhinged she would become. "Yeah," I said, barely holding back a grin as I leaned back in my chair. "I've made sure you can't do this to anyone else." The silence that followed was deafening. She wasn't used to this, wasn't used to losing, wasn't used to being backed into a corner with no way out. I could almost hear her mind racing, scrambling for some kind of leverage, some way to manipulate her way out of this mess, some trick she hadn't used yet. But she had nothing left, and she knew it. "You have no idea what you've started," she finally said, her voice lower now, more dangerous, like a wounded animal trying to convince itself that it still had the power to fight. "You think you can just humiliate me, ruin my name, take everything from me, and walk away unscathed? You think I don't have friends in high places? You think I can't destroy you?" I exhaled slowly, shaking my head as I stared at the city lights through the window, feeling nothing but satisfaction. "You already tried to destroy me, Olivia," I reminded her, my voice steady, my grip tightening around the phone. "You threw me out of my own house. You stole what was mine. You built your entire life on lies, and now those lies are catching up to you." She let out a sharp breath, the silence on the other end thick with barely controlled rage. "I will bury you in court," she snarled. "I don't care what the news says. I don't care what anyone says. You are nothing, Daniel. You've always been nothing. You think people care about your little sob story? You think anyone is actually on your side? I will make sure you regret this." I smiled to myself, knowing exactly what this was. Fear disguised as arrogance. She was terrified, and this was the only way she knew how to react. She couldn't threaten me with money anymore, couldn't manipulate the situation in her favor, couldn't control the narrative the way she always had before. And that scared her more than anything. "You know what, Olivia?" I said finally, my voice as calm as ever. "I don't need to fight you in court anymore. You've already lost. The world sees you for exactly what you are now, and no amount of money, no amount of fake tears, no amount of manipulation is going to change that." Another silence, but this time, I could hear the way her breath hitched slightly, like she was finally realizing that this was a battle she couldn't win. "Enjoy the headlines, Olivia," I added, my tone sharp, final, leaving no room for argument. "Because soon, the only place your name is going to appear is in the court records." Then, without waiting for her response, I ended the call, shutting off my phone completely, knowing that whatever Olivia did next would be out of pure desperation. She had spent years perfecting her act, years weaving a web of lies that had always protected her, years ensuring that she never faced real consequences. But now the entire world was watching. Olivia had spent her entire life perfecting the art of deception, playing whatever role suited her best in the moment, shifting seamlessly between grieving widow, misunderstood victim, and untouchable socialite whenever the situation demanded it. So it was no surprise when she arrived at the courthouse dressed head to toe in expensive black, her face set in the kind of somber expression meant to elicit sympathy from anyone watching. Every detail of her appearance was carefully calculated, from the modest but elegant jewelry to the perfectly styled hair, everything designed to make her look like a woman in mourning, someone who had suffered a great loss, someone who deserved pity. But this time, her carefully curated performance wouldn't save her, and I could already see the cracks forming beneath the surface. As she stepped inside the courtroom, Olivia made a deliberate show of dabbing at her dry eyes with a neatly folded handkerchief, sighing just loud enough for those around her to hear, letting out small, shaky breaths like she was barely holding herself together. It might have worked on someone who didn't know better, might have fooled a stranger into thinking she was just a poor, defenseless widow being unfairly dragged into court by a bitter stepson. But I wasn't a stranger, and neither was Mr. Callahan. We both knew exactly who she was beneath the carefully constructed mask, and today, we were going to rip that mask away in front of everyone. I sat next to Callahan as he arranged his notes, his movements steady, practiced, and methodical, showing no signs of nerves despite the weight of what was about to happen. He had spent his entire career in courtrooms like this, dismantling fraudulent claims, exposing liars, and making sure justice was served. And now, with Olivia sitting just a few feet away, posture stiff, hands clenched tightly in her lap, he was about to do it again. The judge entered, the proceedings began, and just like that, the battle that had been building for weeks finally started. Callahan wasted no time presenting the real will, handing it to the judge along with forensic evidence proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the document Olivia had submitted was a complete forgery. The handwriting analysis alone was damning, showing inconsistencies in the signature, mismatched ink, and formatting errors that no legitimate will should have had. But that was only the beginning. Next came the witnesses. Former employees of my father's company, people who had worked closely with him for years, people who had known him well enough to confirm without question that he had never intended to leave everything to Olivia. One by one, they testified, stating clearly and firmly that my father had spoken many times about securing my future, about ensuring that I was taken care of, about how much he valued the legacy he had built, and how he wanted it to remain in the right hands. They painted a picture of a man who was thoughtful, meticulous, and careful with his estate, a man who would never have made the reckless financial decisions that Olivia had claimed he did in her fraudulent will. But the biggest blow, the moment that finally shattered Olivia's carefully maintained composure, came when Callahan called one last witness to the stand. There was a brief moment of silence as an older woman stepped forward, her presence quiet but commanding, the kind of woman who had been through hell and refused to break under the weight of it. The moment Olivia saw her, her entire body tensed. "This is Mrs. Evelyn Carter," Callahan announced, his voice steady and clear as he turned toward the jury. "And she has a story to tell." Olivia shifted in her seat, her fingers gripping the edges of the table, her face suddenly several shades paler than before. She knew what was coming. Mrs. Carter took a deep breath before speaking, her voice calm but unwavering, carrying the weight of someone who had spent years living with a truth no one had wanted to hear. "My father, Henry Carter, met Olivia several years ago," she began, her gaze locking onto Olivia with quiet fury. She was kind, attentive, and made him feel like he had finally found happiness again after losing my mother. He trusted her. He believed she cared about him. And when he got sick, she took over everything, his finances, his legal documents, his estate planning. Olivia was completely rigid now, her knuckles white as she clenched her hands together. "When my father passed," Mrs. Carter continued, her voice tightening slightly, "Olivia produced a will that gave her complete control over everything. Our family home, his savings, all of his assets. But something didn't feel right. We challenged it in court, just like Daniel is doing now. And before we could take it all the way to trial, Olivia settled." A murmur spread through the courtroom, a ripple of realization moving through the jurors, the audience, even the judge himself. "She paid us off," Mrs. Carter said simply, her eyes never leaving Olivia's. "She offered us just enough money to make us walk away, just enough to avoid a lengthy court battle. And at the time we took it because we didn't have the resources to fight her the way Daniel is fighting her now. But I have no doubt in my mind, she did the same thing to my father that she did to Daniel's." The moment she finished speaking, the room fell into a heavy silence. For the first time since this all began, Olivia had nothing to say. I watched as she sat there, her entire body rigid, her breathing shallow, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. The confident smirk, the fake tears, the soft-spoken widow routine, all of it was gone, stripped away in the span of just a few minutes. She looked small now, cornered, like a wild animal trapped with no escape. The judge cleared his throat, flipping through the evidence one last time, his expression unreadable but undeniably serious. He glanced toward Olivia, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, his tone firm and unyielding, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. And then, finally, she let out a slow, shaky exhale, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened her mouth to speak. But before she could say a single word, Callahan leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "No further questions, Your Honor." And just like that, the walls Olivia had spent years building around herself finally began to crumble. The courtroom was silent, the kind of heavy, suffocating stillness that only happens in moments where everything is about to change, where every person in the room is holding their breath, waiting for the final blow to land. Olivia sat stiffly in her chair, her hands gripping the table so tightly that her knuckles were bone-white, her entire body wound like a coil ready to snap. She had spent the entire trial convincing herself that she would win, that she could manipulate her way out of this the same way she always had before, that no matter how much evidence was stacked against her, she would still walk away unscathed. But as the judge flipped through the final pages of his notes, his expression unreadable but firm, she knew, that this time was different. The judge let out a slow breath before finally speaking, his voice steady and unwavering, filling the room with a weight that felt almost crushing. The court finds that the contested will is fraudulent, he declared, his tone leaving no room for argument, no space for negotiation, no chance for Olivia to twist the truth one last time. All assets will be returned to their rightful heir, Daniel Calloway. The words rang in my ears, reverberating through my chest, a final, undeniable confirmation that I had won. Olivia let out a sharp breath, barely more than a hiss, her hands clenching into fists as if she were trying to physically hold onto the power that was slipping through her fingers. She had built her entire life on control, on deception, on making people believe that she was always one step ahead. But today, in front of an entire courtroom, she had lost everything. The tension in the air should have faded then, should have released the tight grip it had on the room, but the judge wasn't finished yet. He glanced back down at the documents in front of him, his gaze sharpening slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line before he looked back up. Olivia, sensing that something was coming, sat up straighter, her body unnaturally still, as if she could somehow will the moment to pass without further damage. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice carrying the weight of something even more devastating. Due to the pattern of fraudulent activity, the case will be referred to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Olivia flinched. Her head snapped up so fast that for a moment, I thought she might argue, thought she might try one last desperate attempt to plead her innocence, to twist the situation in her favor, to find a way, any way, to get out of what was coming. But she didn't speak. She couldn't. She just sat there, frozen, her eyes wide, her breath shallow, her entire world crumbling around her in ways she had never prepared for. Olivia had always been able to manipulate the legal system, always been able to throw money at problems until they disappeared, always been able to settle disputes before they reached a point where she faced actual consequences. But criminal charges? That wasn't something she could buy her way out of. The courtroom murmured with quiet, shocked whispers, the realization settling over everyone present like a thick fog. This wasn't just about losing my father's estate anymore. This was about Olivia facing the reality of her actions, about her finally being held accountable for the lives she had ruined, about her understanding that this time, there was no escape. She turned slowly toward me then, her expression unreadable, but for the first time since I had met her, there was no condescension in her gaze, no smug amusement, no carefully concealed triumph lurking beneath the surface. There was only fear. It was in the slight tremble of her fingers as she reached for the glass of water in front of her, in the way her chest rose and fell unevenly, in the flicker of panic that crossed her face as she tried to process the reality of what had just happened. And I didn't look away. I let her see me, let her see the man she had underestimated, the man she had tried to erase, the man she had thrown out of his own home without a second thought. Because no matter what she had told herself, no matter what she had believed, she had never been invincible. And now, the entire world knew it. The bailiff stepped forward then, his presence a quiet but undeniable signal that this was over, that Olivia no longer had a place at this table, that her time manipulating the system had officially run out. He nodded toward her, his expression impassive but firm. "Ma'am, please stand." Olivia hesitated, as if part of her still refused to accept that this was real, that this was actually happening, that she was no longer in control. But after a long, excruciating moment, she finally rose to her feet, her movements stiff, mechanical, like a marionette whose strings had been abruptly cut. She didn't look at me again, didn't speak, didn't offer any final words of defiance or dignity. She just stood there as security escorted her out of the courtroom, her carefully curated life unraveling with every step she took. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding, the weight of everything finally settling into my chest, not just the victory, but the justice of it all. Olivia had spent years taking from people, ruining families, leaving destruction in her wake without ever looking back. She had believed she was untouchable, that no one could stop her, that the lies she had told would protect her forever. But now she was nothing more than another criminal facing the consequences she had spent a lifetime avoiding. And as I sat there, hands steady, heart pounding, mind finally at peace, I realized that this wasn't just about winning back what was mine. It was about making sure she never did this to anyone again. I stood in front of my house, the same place I had been forced to walk away from weeks ago, when Olivia had stood in the doorway with that smug, self-satisfied smirk, telling me I had no right to be there. But now, the roles had reversed, the power had shifted, and the woman who had spent her life taking from others had finally lost everything. I wasn't standing on the street with nowhere to go, wasn't carrying my life in hastily packed bags, wasn't looking at my own home like it was some distant memory of a life that had been stolen from me. This time, I wasn't the one leaving. The house looked exactly the same as it had when I left, but it felt different, like something had shifted in the air, like the weight of Olivia's presence had finally been lifted, like the poison she had spread throughout my father's legacy had been scrubbed clean. The locks had already been changed, ensuring that she could never set foot inside again, and the last of her things had been removed, her belongings nothing more than remnants of a life she had tried to steal but could never truly claim as her own. She was gone, not just from my home, but from my father's world, from my life, from the carefully built empire she had nearly destroyed. I stepped forward, my fingers tightening around the new keys as I pushed open the front door, inhaling deeply as I crossed the threshold. The scent of polished wood and faint traces of my father's old cologne still lingered in the air, a reminder of the man who had built this home, who had filled it with love, who had never intended for it to fall into the hands of someone like Olivia. I ran my fingers along the edge of the doorframe, feeling the familiar grooves, the tiny dents and imperfections that had been there for years, unchanged despite everything that had happened. This wasn't just a house. This wasn't just a victory in a courtroom. This was the place where I had grown up, where my father had laughed, where memories had been made, where family had once been everything. And Olivia had tried to take it all from me. She had spent her entire life preying on grieving families, sinking her claws into wealthy men who were too blinded by love or loneliness to see her for what she really was. She had perfected the art of manipulation, had turned deception into a carefully crafted game, had convinced herself that she was untouchable, that she could do this over and over again without ever facing consequences. But this time, she had picked the wrong target. She had assumed that I would roll over, that I would give up, that I would walk away quietly and let her rewrite history to suit her own twisted version of events. She had counted on me being too broken, too lost, too afraid to fight. She had miscalculated, because I hadn't just fought back. I had won. I walked through the house slowly, my footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floors, taking in every inch of the space that had once felt like it had been stolen from me. The living room still held the same furniture my father had carefully picked out, the bookshelves lined with old novels that had belonged to my mother, the framed photographs that Olivia had taken down now restored to their rightful places. It was like breathing life back into something that had been suffocating under the weight of her lies, like peeling away the layers of rot she had left behind to reveal something pure, something real, something that had always been mine. I stopped in front of my father's study, my hand resting against the door for a moment before I pushed it open, stepping inside the room that had once been a sanctuary. The heavy oak desk stood exactly as it had before, the chair still tucked neatly behind it, the faint scent of old leather and paper filling the air. My father had spent hours in this room, had built his legacy here, had made plans for the future, plans that Olivia had tried to rewrite in her own favor. But now, those plans would finally be honored the way he had intended. This wasn't just about winning. It wasn't just about proving that Olivia had been a fraud, that she had stolen, that she had manipulated and deceived and nearly gotten away with it. This was about making sure my father's true wishes were respected, about making sure that the home he had built wasn't tainted by the greed of someone who had never truly belonged here. This was about ensuring that no one else ever suffered at Olivia's hands again, that she never had the chance to ruin another family, to manipulate another grieving man, to rewrite another person's legacy in her own image. Most of all, this was about taking back what was mine. I exhaled slowly, my chest rising and falling with a sense of finality, of closure, of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. Olivia had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, she had lost the one thing she valued more than anything: control. She had spent her life believing she was always the one pulling the strings, that no one could ever stand in her way, that the world would always bend to her will. But now she was nothing. She had no home, no stolen fortune, no reputation to hide behind, no carefully crafted image to protect her. And I had everything. I reached for one of the old picture frames sitting on my father's desk, my fingers brushing against the glass as I looked down at the familiar image of the two of us standing in front of the house, smiling like we had all the time in the world. He had always been my greatest supporter, my unwavering source of strength, my reminder that integrity mattered more than wealth, that character meant more than success. And even though he was gone, even though I would never hear his voice again, I knew, without a doubt, that he would be proud of me. I had fought for his legacy. I had honored his wishes. I had taken back what was rightfully mine.